Hello, everyone. Welcome to the overview for our last lesson, lesson 6. I'm going to share a screen, and then we'll see what we've got to take a look at in this lesson. All right, so we are looking at saber versus conocer. The important thing to know is that both of these verbs mean to know. We use them in different ways. Saber and conocer, they mean the same thing, but they both, and they both have irregular yo forms. The yo form of saber is yo sé. Little accent is nice if you can remember to put it in. And the yo form of conocer is yo conozco. Other than that, in the present tense, all the other conjugations are regular. What do we use them for? Well, we use saber if we know a fact or information or how to do something. Here's an example. Yo sé que hay un examen mañana. I know something. I know a piece of information. There's an exam tomorrow. Here's another one. Mis amigos saben bailar muy bien. They know how to do something. They know how to dance. Okay? Now, conocer is generally, as a general rule, is used when you're personally familiar with a person or a place. For example, mi hermana conoce a Taylor Swift. Now, the connotation here, the nuance says, really means that my sister has met Taylor Swift. She knows her, not just about her. And so we use the verb conocer because she actually knows her. Yo conozco Paris is clearly saying that you've been to Paris, that you know it because you've been there. Okay, so that's basically all there is. A couple of irregular conjugations in the yo form, and then different uses for saber, which is used for information or facts or doing something, and then conocer if you're familiar with a place or a person. Okay, that's about it for conocer versus saber. Indirect object pronouns. Well, what do they do? In general terms, an indirect object pronoun tells us who something is for. Now that's a vague generalization, and it does other things, but that's not a bad way of putting it, right? I give you some examples in English. They gave me the money yesterday. Me tells who they gave the money to. The money was for me. So the may is an indirect object pronoun in English. Sorry, me. Me is a indirect object pronoun in English. She's going to tell them the secret. She's going to tell a secret. Them is whoever they are. It's not very clear in the sentence, but they are going to receive the secret. So them is the indirect object pronoun that tells who the secret is being told to. Now let's take a look. In Spanish, the IOPs, indirect object pronouns, are me, te, le, nos, and les. These look a lot like direct object pronouns, but of course this third person singular and plural is slightly different. Let's take a look at some examples here. Maria me da el libro. She gives me the book. The book is for me. She's giving the book to me or for me. So this may tells who that is for, okay? Here's another one with an infinitive, a conjugated verb and an infinitive. You can see what happens here. We've studied this before. Yo voy a prestarles mi carro. I'm going to loan them my car. We'll see this in just another second here, but we could equally put this les in front of the void if we wanted to. It's an option. Okay, let's take a look. Placement rules for IOPs are exactly the same as DOPs. They can always be placed in front of the conjugated verb. In a sentence with an infinitive or a gerund, you have a choice. You can place the IOP in front of the conjugated verb, which I just demonstrated, or after and attached. So here's identical sentences except for the placement of the indirect object pronoun. Ellos nos quieren vender el carro. They want to sell us the car. I put the nos in front of the conjugated verb, but I can also do it like this. Ellos quieren vendernos el carro, just like direct object pronouns. Clarification. Sometimes in Spanish, a sentence may not be clear as to exactly whom something is for. For example, look at this sentence. Voy a decirles la verdad. I don't really know who, if there's no context, if you haven't mentioned anybody yet, we don't really know who they are. And that's also could be ustedes. It could be, I'm going to tell you guys the truth. So there's a way to clarify that. To do that, we simply add a plus the person's names, and you can even do this in front of the sentence or at the end. Here's an example. I'm going to clarify this sentence. Voy a decirles la verdad a mis padres. Now it's very clear who I'm going to tell the truth to my parents, okay? All right, let's move on then. We've got into the preterite tense. Now, the preterite tense is also known as the simple past tense, and this is just speaking in the past tense in the simplest possible way. I ate, we swam, we watched. Okay, verb conjugations like that. That's called the preterite tense. Now, Conjugating a verb in the preterite is similar to the present tense. You drop off the ending, AR, ER, or IR, but you add different endings to make it the preterite tense. So here they are. In this particular set, I've got the AR endings only, and they are A, aste, O, amos, and aron. Notice that just by chance, I guess, the present tense ending for nosotros form of AR verbs is the same in both the present tense and the preterite tense. It's easy to clarify if there's some confusion for you, okay? So here's your endings. You need to know them. It's also very nice to know that these get a little accent because it can change the meaning sometimes. Yo hablo is not the same thing as el hablo. Big difference there, right, in the meaning. So here's a couple of examples for you. En la tienda, Miguel compró, here's the he, she form, una chaqueta, y sus amigos compraron, they bought, unos zapatos. Okay, let's move on. And there's a little bit about the accent. I have a written accent. You should try to remember to put it in. Let's see. ER and IR preterite endings are similar to AR ones, but they have different letters because it's a different set of verbs, ER and IR. So here's your endings, iste, yo, imos, and yeron. Again, the two accents. Here's a couple examples. Ayer ustedes vieron, this is the verb ver in the preterite tense for you guys, una película. Sí, nosotros vimos Avatar or Avatar en la tele. Okay, so there's your preterite endings. This is, I want to put out, I want to make you aware that you really need to go to page 206, 207 in Vistas for a good overview of the preterite because there are lots of rules about stem changing verbs and verbs with other kind of spelling changes in the preterite tense. You need to be familiar with all that, but I'm not going to go over it right here because it is a little lengthy and a little complicated. But go to this page, these two pages, and check it out in your book so you can go over that. All right, reflexive verbs, the last thing we have to study. And by the way, this is actually technically part of lesson 7, but we're going to pop it into lesson 6 because it's a really good thing to know. Reflexive verbs, we use them all the time. What do? A verb that has a reflexive pronoun with it reflect the action of the verb back onto the doer of the verb. It's kind of a simplification, but it's relatively a good way to think of it, right? Many verbs can be reflexive depending on the chosen meaning. So example here, I see the photo. I've got a photo in my hand. I see it. I get it. Then I look up and I'm looking in the mirror and I see myself. Well, that is a reflexive pronoun. Why is it reflexive? Because it reflected the doing, the action of the verb back onto me. So by adding a reflexive pronoun to the second sentence, I reflect the seeing back onto myself. So many verbs can be either reflexive or regular. Here's an example. Raul bathes the dog, and then he bathes himself. Now, I know we don't use the verb to bathe very often in English anymore, but I think it illustrates the point very well. He washes the dog, and then he washes himself, right? He bathes the dog, he bathes himself. This little reflexive pronoun here shows you that, okay? In English, the reflexive pronouns are, just so you got a clear idea of what we're talking about here, myself, yourself, himself, herself, or itself, ourselves, and themselves, okay? They see themselves. We see ourselves, okay? So that's what they are in English. Let's take a look at what we do in Spanish. Me, te, se, nos, and se. Notice again, these start out just like direct object pronouns and indirect object pronouns, but this bottom one, the third person singular and plural, are different. You need to be aware of them, okay? So what did I say? I just give some examples of reflexive verbs in Spanish. Yo me despierto a las 6 y me levanto a las 6:30. I wake myself up at 6 and I get myself up at 6:30. Here's another one. María se baña y luego se maquilla. She bathes herself. No, this is not a really reflexive verb in English, but it is in Spanish. So she bathes herself and then later she puts on her makeup on herself. She puts her makeup on herself is really what you're saying in Spanish, okay? I'm going to give you a list of the verbs that you might not expect to find as being reflexive because in English we don't make them reflexive. I said, note that many verbs in English that are not necessarily reflexive must be reflexive in Spanish. And the following is a partial list, right? So I put in the little stem changes. Some of these are stem changing verbs. You need to be aware of that. So these verbs, see if I can show them all here. I can show almost all of them. These verbs are almost always reflexive in Spanish if you're just talking about stuff. So wake up, to get up, to bathe, to shower. Bañarse kind of means both these days. To put on your makeup, to take off clothing, all reflexive verbs. And you're aware that they're reflexive verbs because of the say that comes attached to the infinitive. Okay. Now let's do one more thing. What about placement rules? Reflexive pronouns follow exactly the same placement rules as DOPs and IOPs. They can always be placed before a conjugated verb. If a sentence contains either an infinitive or gerund, they may, it's your option, be placed after and attached to the infinitive or gerund. So I gave you an example here. Mi hijo se está acostando. Here we've got a gerund. This is the present progressive. I chose in this sentence to put the say in front. He's putting himself to bed. Now he's going to bed. Really what you're saying is he's putting himself to bed now. I chose to put it in this sentence before the conjugated verb. In this sentence, I decided to put it after and attached to the gerund. Mi hijo está acostándose ahora. Here's another one with an infinitive. Mis padres se van a despertar temprano mañana. They're going to wake up early tomorrow. I decided to put it in front of my conjugated verb. Mis padres van a despertarse temprano mañana. In this case, I chose to put it after and attached to the infinitive. And that is basically our lesson. So I'm going to stop the share right now. Find it. There we go. And I hope that you have enjoyed this lesson. I hope you've enjoyed the class. And we're going to pretty much be ending this lesson very soon along with the course. So thank you for being with me and hanging out. And that's about it for right now. Hasta luego.